All right, it's 5 minutes past the hour. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. This session is about the value of values. Now, the idea is very simple, right? We're all understanding that we need to do a lot more, a lot faster. And one of the ways that people can be convinced to do a lot more and a lot faster is because it's the right thing to do. It comports with their values. It's the morally correct thing to do. Another is to see the financial value. Now, I believe that people want to see both mostly. Some people will do it just because it's the right thing to do, but some people will see that there are financial benefits. For example, these four main categories of organizational financial benefit, and they will do it. And the four categories conveniently form the acronym CORE: customer, operations, risk, and employees. These are the core benefits of sustainability, and they produce value. Now, there's a fifth benefit, which is not financial, but leadership. People are more likely to follow a leader who shares their values. We're not going to cover that much today, but it is something that can be of personal value to you and to others. What we're going to talk about instead today is the value, financially speaking, of values. And we're going to start with an illustration of the value in terms of employee benefits. We're going to use a tool that my organization developed and that we've used with clients and stuff as a way to illustrate this in employee-related value, right? The E in CORE, the employee-related value. That is based on this tool right here, which you can see is about valuing the talent-related benefits of acting on values. And that's sort of a mouthful, but basically it answers this question: how much is it worth when an organization's employees know that the organization shares their values? That's the key question. Now, in the beginning, what we're going to do is we're going to take some basic kind of demographics of the organization. I won't spend much time on this except to say that in the tool, you enter the revenue, operating income, and so forth. There are also little tips if you're not sure what to put, give you a reasonable amount. These are example numbers. Now, I'm going to be talking about a particular conversation I had with someone at a 60,000 person organization. You can see I've gone ahead and put in 60,000 right here. This is not the exact situation, of course, but I was talking to this woman who runs sustainability and social responsibility at a 60,000 person organization. And these are not her organization's numbers, as you can imagine, but for simplicity's sake, we'll say that based on her industry, which is a slightly lower than average paying industry in the US, that average salary is 40,000, but it's a higher attrition industry. So if you're in hospitality, for example, attrition's a little higher. They're growing a little bit, but not that much. They have some non-US presence where the salaries are lower and attrition is high outside the US as well. So these are the basic demographics of the organization. As I say, I won't spend much time on that. But here we get into the first type of reason that people underestimate the value of values. Now, the first reason they underestimate what financial value values create is because a lot of the value produced by sustainability is what we call submerged. And here's an example. You can see here that there's a line item for the months it takes to fill an open position. Now, why is that? Well, the reason is because filling an open position actually ends a cost. And here's how that works. And this is what I mean by a submerged value and a submerged cost. If you are recruiting for a position, then by definition, you're doing so because you think that the value produced by having someone in that position will be greater than what you have to pay them to take it. In other words, if you're recruiting for a position, then there's a cost to having that open position. If that weren't the case, you simply would stop recruiting for it, which means that when you think about it, that open position is a cost, a submerged cost, which means one that's only obvious in hindsight, and that having it open for 1.5 months is actually a cost. Now, there's another type of cost that contributes to people underestimating the value of values, and that's what we call obscured. That is things people know, but they don't quantify. And here, the example that we have on this page is the productivity. First 6 months on a job, people are less productive than they are eventually. Now, we've been conservative here and said they're 75% as productive. In fact, at a large tech company, manager said to an employee, don't worry about being productive your first 6 months. You're still figuring things out. But to be conservative, we're not going to say that they're really unproductive. We're going to say they're only 25% less productive than they will be later. Now, there are some other things on this page, recruiting and training and so forth. We're going to skip past those. Those are useful in more detailed examinations. But for the purpose of today, we'll go ahead and skip past those. Now, here is the beginning of putting the math to those submerged and those obscured values. If you have 60,000 employees, you're growing a little bit, you have 50% attrition, you're hiring 30,000 people a year. Now, here's another example of a submerged cost, which we call new hire premium. If you want to hire someone away from their current job, you typically have to pay them more than they currently make. Recruiters will tell people, don't leave your current job unless you're getting a bump of at least 15%. Well, you're 15% times average salary times 30,000 employees, kind of a lot of money. But we're not going to say that you don't have to pay people more to lure them to your company. Now, it turns out there are people who will switch jobs for a company that shares their values for no additional money. And sometimes people even take a pay cut. But we're not going to say that because we're going to be conservative with the numbers. We're going to say it's only a 10% decrease from 15% to 13.5%. Now, engagement. This is another one of those obscured costs, right? What we're doing is we're talking about submerged and obscured costs through examples here. Employee engagement, everybody knows that people who believe the company shares their values are more engaged. But the question is, how do you put numbers on that? Well, the first thing is to have a baseline, and Gallup surveys a couple million people a year for its workplace engagement survey business. They say about 1/3 of employees around the world are engaged. But to be conservative, we're going to say 50%. The reason that's conservative is that means there's less room for improvement. That's why this is a conservative estimate. Then you have to look at what the engagement increase due to shared values is. And the research shows that's about 20%. We're looking at 1/3 of that, 7%. Well, 50% room for improvement, 7% improvement, 3.5 points of improvement. So you go from 50 to 53.5% engagement. Again, we're being conservative with the numbers here. And then we say, all right, how much does that generate in productivity? Now, people often will already understand that there's an engagement benefit, but they won't be able to put numbers to that for productivity. But it turns out there are studies showing you get about 20% of the bump in engagement in terms of productivity. In this case, 0.7% increase in productivity. That's not that much. And again, we're being conservative here because we want the numbers to be credible. We'll come back to that later. But you need to quantify submerged and obscured value in a way that's credible. All right. To be extra conservative, we're going to say only 2/3 of that actually gets turned into bottom line value. Maybe people spend a little more time with their family. They leave work a little earlier because they're more productive, whatever. And we're going to say that there's a reduction in attrition. Now, studies show 20 to 50% reduction. We're going to be conservative again, 10%. That drops at 5 points from 50 to 45 in both the US and internationally. All right, we're going to just pause here for a second and give you a chance to type in the chat. Is this the right speed? Any questions? Sean, if you could just monitor the chat and let us know what people say. I'll give you about 10 seconds to do that. If you have a question, go ahead and type that in. Is this the right speed? Are there any things that are confusing about how we're talking about submerged and obscured value or the example specifically here? While we do that, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit more about the conversation. So I'm having a conversation with this woman who's the head of what they called CSR. People call it different things, but this organization called it CSR, 60,000 person company, hospitality industry. And I said to her, how much do you think is the financial benefit in terms of talent of acting on values? And she said, well, I think it's about $3 million a year. Now, this is great because most people, when you ask them that question, they say, I don't know. But the problem is, I don't know doesn't go into spreadsheets. I don't know doesn't go into ROI calculations. If you say, I don't know to a finance person, they leave it out of the spreadsheet, which gives it a value of 0. But as Professor John Sturman at MIT Sloan says, if something has a value and you don't give it one, you're in effect giving it the only value it can't possibly have, which is 0. And that's what happens if you answer, I don't know. But as I said, she didn't do that. She said, I think it's about $3 million a year. But, she said, I think my executives would say about $300,000 a year. Now, the problem is if you're looking at a company that's in the tens of billions of dollars in revenue, $300,000 benefit is not going to get a lot of attention. It's also a problem because she thought it was worth 10 times as much as they thought. Now, that's also an issue, right? You don't want that kind of disconnect. All right, so that's the setup for the conversation. Sean, any questions, comments, things we need to talk about from the chat? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and keep going then. If we look here, the next page is about, is there a cost to tell people about how you share their values and so on? We won't go into this in any detail, except to say that in this case, it's a little more than $500,000 to tell them about it, give them understanding of it and so on. All right, that brings us to the final piece, which is putting dollar figures on these things, right? We talked about quantifying the submerged and obscured value. What's the total? Well, remember the situation. The woman who was in charge of CSR said, this is about $3 million a year, but my executives would say it's 300,000. Well, first problem is we talked about, that means that her executives think it's worth 1/10 as much as she does. Second problem is when you actually do the numbers, it turns out she was also off. The real number is $50 million a year, which means she was off by over a factor of 10 as well. And her executives were off by a factor of over 100, in this case, about 150. Now, if you think something's worth $1, and in fact, it's worth $150, you're likely to be under-investing in it. And that's what happens here. That's the problem when it comes to the value of values. If you don't do a good job on quantifying the submerged and obscured cost, then you miss the value of the employee benefits of sustainability and sustainable action. And in this case, those benefits are much, much, much greater than people think. And in fact, that's normally the case. Normally the case is that the benefits are dramatically higher than people think. We tend to see 4 to 10 times. In this case, as you saw, compared to what her executives thought, the answer was much higher than that even. The answer was 150 times as much as they thought. All right, so that brings us to the end of our employee benefits illustration example. Now we're going to talk about another part of the core benefits of sustainability, customers. Now we're going to go over the customer journey in a little bit, just at a high level, so that we can have a reference point for later. So first, you have prospects, they become aware of your company, and then you have to stand out, right? You have to get them to notice you as part of being aware of you. And sustainability helps with that. We'll come to that more in a minute, but being a more sustainable company helps with awareness. Then they have to choose you, right? They have to say, hey, we're going to go that way or this way. And sustainability helps with that. If you share their values, they're more likely to choose you as well. Then they have to go ahead and buy and be willing to pay the price that you're charging and so forth. There are some people who pay more for a more sustainable product for a company that's more in line with their values. We're not going to talk about that much because although it exists, that's not the biggest benefit from sustainability, it turns out. The biggest benefit from value of values is the awareness, the choice, and so on. Then they have to use or experience the product, right? Do we like it? And does it work? And do I like the experience of it? Now here you'll often hear people say something like, well, sustainability or values is just the icing on the cake, right? The cake, this is just the icing. It's not that big a deal. And that is in fact true, but it turns out that when you go to a bakery, the cakes are iced. Why? Because it's not the most important thing, but it still makes a difference in their willingness to buy and their experience of the cake, right? Sustainability might be the icing on the cake, but still matter. We'll come to that more in a minute. Then they evaluate, hey, did I love it? Or did I like it, or did I not like it at all? And then they tell others, hey, this is what I thought of it. I liked it, I didn't like it, whatever. In general, people are more likely to talk about a negative experience than a positive one. But one interesting thing about a company that shares their values, their sustainability, and so on, is that they're more likely to tell others than they would otherwise be. We call this vocality, how vocal they are. Now, when they tell others, they make others aware, and they convince others to choose. It turns out that most people are something like 6 times more likely to be influenced by something that someone they know says than by an advertisement, for example, or some other way of communication, which means that not only when they tell others do they make others more aware, but they affect their choice much more. And that, of course, leads to a reinforcing cycle of increasing sales, right? They tell others, others buy, those others tell others, and so on. And then the last step is they actually leave the company, right? They don't typically stay customers forever. They enjoy the first year, and then eventually over the years, their interest and their attraction to the company declines and they leave. Okay, so that's the basic cycle for customers. Now let's look at a specific example with numbers. And we'll take this through and we'll talk about how this works and how sustainability matters. First thing is, let's say this is a company that's fairly new. Let's say grocery delivery, to make it simple, and that there are 1 million incoming customers a year. They attract 1 million customers. Those customers last on average about 2 years, 24 months. What happens when you attract 1 million a year and they last on average 2 years is you have 2 million current customers. That's just how the math works. Now let's say that they buy once a month at $50 per order, and therefore you get $600 a year. These numbers are obviously made to be a little bit easier to understand, a little bit more round. But, let's just say that you get $600 a year out of these customers. Well, $600 times 2 million customers, $1.2 billion in revenue per year. To make the math easy, we'll say the margin is 10%. That's $120 million and in gross profit. And then there's some cost to serve the customers, $30 each, just let's say, times 2 million customers, 60 million. And then there's the acquisition cost. You have to spend, say, $30 million in marketing to attract the 1 million customers. And therefore, your value there is $30 million, which leaves what we're going to call operating income before depreciation and amortization of $30 million. Now, the specific measure of profitability doesn't really matter. This one is usable in a lot of ways. It's becoming more popular because it doesn't make you deal with things like taxes and depreciation, amortization, and capital structure and all that stuff. Long story short, it doesn't really matter. The story will be the same no matter what measure we use, except there will be either additions or subtractions of depreciation, amortization, taxes, and so on. Let's do the simple thing for the purpose of this example and just say OIBDA. All right, $30 million. That's the base case. Now, what happens when you introduce the idea that the company shares the potential customers' values? Well, the first thing is that customers are a little bit more likely to choose you. We talked about this. They're a little more likely to be aware. They're a little more likely to choose you. So let's say it's a 5% bump. That means that you acquire, for the same amount of effort and spending, you acquire another 50,000 customers per year. That means you have a total of 100,000 additional customers in the customer base. That 5% bump yields, when you go all the way through the numbers, it yields a 10% increase in operating income, right? OIBDA. That's great. Now, the second thing that happens is that customers stay longer. Now, I did this analysis for a $30 billion company, even business-to-business company. We looked at thousands of their customers and determined that, in fact, they stayed longer. The ones that engage with them with sustainability actually stayed longer. So in this case, we're going to say that's a 25% increase in customer lifetime from 24 months to 30 months. And you can see the other changes that ripple through, ending up with a 63% increase in the value that that they receive. So we're going to pause here for a second and go ahead and type into the chat, is this the right speed? Anything confusing, any questions or definitional issues or anything like that? Anybody want me to repeat what OIBDA is? Go ahead and just go ahead and type something into the chat for a second now. While you do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about why some of these things happen and why they get missed sometimes. The reason that people miss these things sometimes is not so much that they don't understand that customers are more likely to buy from a company that they believe shares their values. Of course, marketing people know this already. People give personalities to brands, but they're not quite sure how to quantify the effect that a sustainable brand or one that shares their values has. And it turns out one of the ways you can do that is you can go through trust. That when an individual believes a company shares their values, they trust the company more. And what happens when an individual trusts the company more? They're more likely to believe them, they're more likely to buy from them, and they're more likely to buy from them quickly, all of which increases the value of that potential customer and how much they are willing to pay and how often they're willing to buy. All right, continuing on with our example, if you have increased customer lifetime of 25%, that drives some increased value. What happens if you also increase their spend, right? So they spend a little more with you because, for example, they take some of the money they're spending with a competitor and they shift it to you, right? Because the competitor doesn't share their values as much and you do. We're going to say this is a 20% increase in customer spend per month. And it turns out when you add that to the increase in the customers and the customer lifetime, look at that difference in operating income. 168% higher than it was in the base case, than the $30 million in the base case. So that's a big difference. And it turns out that one organization that I know well, the individuals were willing to pay more, the customers were willing to pay more, or to shift some of their buying from another company to that one because it shared their values. All right, continuing on, what if there's an increase in margin? Now here we're not necessarily saying that people are willing to pay more for the company, for the actual product or to the company. We're not going to say that specifically. What we're going to say instead is that they're more likely to say buy higher margin services. So a company that I worked with, the organizations that were purchasing from the company not only were more likely to buy and to stay longer, but they would buy the higher margin add-ons. And that increased the overall margin of the sales to those customers because those customers did that to a greater degree when they believed the customer and the company shared values, when they believed the company was a sustainable company and they believed in sustainability and so on. Well, you increase margin by only 10% and you get a very, very nice further increase in the profitability of this business. Right now we're looking at going from 30 to almost $100 million a year, over 200% improvement. All right, and if they also cut customer acquisition costs, right? We talked about earlier that you acquire a few more customers, but maybe you can also spend a little less because the vocality kicks in, reduces customer acquisition cost, and so in total, you can actually cut back a little bit. Now you're looking at almost a 250% cumulative increase in the profit of this business. That's what I mean by the customer aspect of submerged value. So let me pause there and say that although all these things added together produce really tremendous amounts of value, even any individual piece can be worth quite a bit, right? We saw that there was a noticeable increase in profit at several different steps along the chain. If having values and acting on values increases profitability that much, then any individual area may very well be worth doing individually. And then cumulatively, that's when you really unlock some tremendous power. All right, we're gonna stop. We're gonna stop here for a second and take a question from Worth. Thank you for putting a question, Worth. Worth's question is, has this framework been applied to anti-bribery shared value? And actually, it turns out, yes, there's a specific section of our method and our tools that's about risk. And one of the big risks that is submerged is the risk that bribery will distort the marketplace. For example, if you are a company that builds walls or that creates medicines, and it becomes obvious that when you want to get a new government customer, or when you want to merge with another company, that the decision about who gets the customer is not so much based on, say, who's going to do the best job or who's got the best price, but rather who's got the best connections into the government and who has found a way to line the pockets of the government officials making the decision. Then that means that the company is at risk of losing that business for no good reason. And in fact, that is a significant risk. There are organizations that rate countries based on how kind of clean the economy is, government is, and so forth. And you can actually quantify that. And we have an entire risk tool, it turns out, that quantifies things like this, and that enables us to show the value of reducing different kinds of risks. And one of those types of risks is this bribery risk, this distortion risk of the market. All right. So Worth, I hope that helped. Go ahead and enter something more if you want to talk more about that, or if that didn't address the question fully, or if you want to discuss that more. Are there other questions? Other questions? As Sean has typed into the chat, we want to give people a chance to go ahead and enter more questions. While we do that, I'm just going to demonstrate something quickly. Worth, I was talking about in response to your question about bribery value and so forth. I was talking about the tool that we have that does in fact quantify these kinds of risks. Let me just share a brief visual of that. You can see that you can change the risks geography. So you can see, you select Africa and it shows the risks associated with Africa. You can look at the threat type. So this would be economic or governance or environmental or so forth. If you switch to environmental, for example, you see drought, emissions tax, rare earth price increases, and so on. You can change the time horizon, 1 year versus, say, 20 years, and you see those shift. And then you can change the business unit. So if you have multiple business units, consumer, enterprise, and so on, one of the types of risks is, in fact, this governance risk, governance risk, which is how you look at the types of risks that are involved in bribery. Okay, we have another question from Anouk. How do we make sure that the companies are not just greenwashing instead of implementing real corporate social responsibility? Well, that's a very good question. And for example, Anouk mentions that Greenpeace bought stock from fuel companies to attend shareholder meetings. That makes sense, right? If you're going to attend the shareholder meeting, often you have to be a shareholder. And so it makes sense that they would buy their way in, so to speak, so they can make their perspective heard. And the question is, how do we make sure companies are not just greenwashing? Well, it turns out there are a number of different ways. One way is to look at the third parties that talk about their commitments and so on. And another one is to look at their performance. Now, you want to look at performance across multiple different dimensions. We have something we call impacts science, which in fact does that, looks at not only their performance of their business practices, like do they use clean energy, for example, but also look at the product that they make and the effect the product they make has. The simple example is, even if you make your cigarettes with clean energy, the product itself still has a detrimental effect. And the same thing can be true. For example, if you run a social network that the more people use it, the less happy they are, and that provides a platform for undermining democracy, and that you don't monitor that or take care of that, then it doesn't really matter if you're using clean energy to run that platform, because the product itself has a negative effect. And in fact, that's another part of impact science, right? How are people dealing with their products as well as their business practices? Then there are a few other things. For example, being a catalyst, right? We talked about submerged value and submerged impact. That's true not just financially, but in other ways as well. As a simple example, it turns out that when you donate medicine, for example, to sub-Saharan Africa, you, of course, the person who receives the medicine gets healthier, but surprisingly, there are a few other effects. First of all, the person is then more able to work, and that increases the income of the family, and that we know increases health. It also actually increases gender equity. Well, why is that? Because one thing the UN tells us is that if there is someone sick in the family in sub-Saharan Africa, the person who stays home with them is likely to be a girl. And if that person is not sick, the girl is much more likely to go to school. The UN tells us both these things, which means that when you actually are creating impact in terms of the health of that individual, you're creating also economic impact because they can work, and you're creating gender equity impact because the girl doesn't stay home with them, instead is being educated. You can look at all these different things in their reports, and you can put them all together in our impact science or in a different measure. You can also look at their performance on, for example, their own internal gender equity and their own internal diversity and inclusion and justice goals and so forth. And these are ways that you can see that they're actually doing things and not just greenwashing. All right. All right, other questions. So let's look at this for a second. You'll see that in the chat, Sean has asked, what are the biggest barriers for you to demonstrating the value of values, the value of acting on values? Well, let me talk about that while you think about it yourself, and then go ahead and type your answers into the chat. One of the big barriers that people face is they don't know where to start. And that's why the core framework was developed, to give you a place to start, right? Start by looking at effects on customers, operations, risk, and employees. And that helps a lot. Another thing that helps a lot is to make sure that you have some ability to do that kind of quantification. That is, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? So when you're looking at the customer's operations, risks, and employee benefits, the quantification doesn't have to be perfect. The reason is that when you're looking at submerged value in particular, the submerged value is value that tends to get missed. And what happens when you miss the value is that it doesn't get included in, for example, a calculation of ROI or a spreadsheet or the financial decision-making, the investment decision-making. Only the visible value gets included because the submerged value simply gets missed. And when it doesn't get included, it gets given, in effect, a value of 0, right? And yet you can see that the visible value is a small fraction of the submerged value, right? We looked earlier at the case of the hospitality company, but this is true broadly, 4 to 10 times as much is submerged as is visible typically, sometimes much more than that. And that means that one of the big one of the big barriers is not seeing the submerged value. And that's why we've cataloged dozens of different techniques for doing this and for finding them and for surfacing that submerged value. And then another big barrier is how do you actually quantify the obscured value? And here you saw things like everyone knows that people are more engaged when the company shares their values, but how do you quantify that? And it turns out you can do that as well. There are studies, we particularly have data on that. We've run experiments on that. For example, we ran 4 different kinds of experiments to see how much customers cared about that for a $100 billion company we worked with. You can run different experiments. You can look at academic research. There's a lot of good research out there as well. You can use all these different techniques to find the numbers. And then when you put those numbers together, then that's when you get much more in the way of traction. The other thing I'll say is that they need to be credible. And it's also very helpful if you actually do this with people, right? Not just make a number and say, okay, here's the number, but you go through it with them. And that's why we created tools like this one. And however you end up doing it, it's very, very helpful to do it with people, right? You can go through and you can say, all right, here's the number. What do you think? And what people typically think is, well, actually, I don't believe that. I think that you've overestimated this. I think the engagement increase in our company is only going to be 5%. Okay, fine. You go ahead and change it. Don't argue, just change it. Use the tool, go ahead and change the result. And look, it does drop the benefit, but it drops it to still $50 million, right? It went from 52 to 50. It's still much more than people think. Why? Because that value was submerged, which means it used to be given a value of 0 and now it isn't. All right. We have a couple of minutes left. During that, I want to just make an offer to you. I've written a book called The Value of Values on this topic, and it comes out in January. And I just want to make an offer to share the conclusions with you. If you want, share a review copy with you. The goal is not primarily to make money, not that I'm opposed to making money. Obviously, there is a financial value to sustainability. That's what this whole presentation has been about. But the goal is to make an impact. That's why we're here. That's why we're in the field. And if it would be useful to you to get a summary of the book, there's an early sort of sneak peek on the website. I'm happy to give you a link to that. I can send you a summary of the main points of the book when that's prepared. Send you a review copy of the book if you like. Just send me an email, daronson@valuetis.com. That's daronson@valuetis.com. You can, of course, find me in the directory for the event as well. All right. And of course, the website is valuetis.com. Sean has put my email, phone number, and website into the chat. Thank you, Sean. So feel free to get in touch if you would like to talk further, if you want some examples, if there's somebody that you know that should hear about this, if you want to talk about the book or get a summary or things like that. All right. Well, we're about 1 minute before quarter hour. We want to make sure that you have some time for a break, and then you have a chance to get to the next session. So any last questions? Go ahead and type in last questions. We'll give you a few seconds. Questions, comments, pushback, the desire to take advantage of the offer to talk more or to talk about the book or anything like that. Go ahead and type that into the chat. I'll give you about 15 seconds to do that, and then we'll wrap up. While we do that, just want to thank you for coming and Sean for moderating the chat and Andy for making this whole thing really run. There are dozens and dozens of people behind it, but Andy, who I believe you know, you can see his picture there in the top left corner of your screen, has been instrumental in making this thing happen. It is not easy to pull this thing off, to make it work across time zones and everything else, and we really appreciate that. Thank you to Andy and to everybody involved, including others from the Planetary Emergency Partnership and so forth. Thank you for all your work. And Nalat, since you just joined, I'm just going to mention that in the chat, you'll see how to get in touch if you want a copy of the book, or you want some summary from the book, The Value of Values, which comes out in January. No cost. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'll leave you with this thought. Values have value. People don't understand how much, and therefore they don't do as much, right? If someone currently isn't acting, but they're, say, on the fence, then helping them understand how much value there is to acting helps push them off the fence on the side of doing something. That's what we need, and that's what we're here for.